This is the Ink Therapist. Real talk about healing, bodies, and the world we're actually living in. Welcome to the Ink Therapist. Before we get started, a quick reminder. I'm a licensed therapist, but listening to this podcast does not create a therapist-client relationship between us. The information shared here is for educational and entertainment purposes only and shouldn't replace professional mental health care. If you're in crisis or need personalized support, please reach out to a licensed mental health provider in your area or contact a crisis or warm line. And with that, let's jump in. I want to describe a specific experience. You have finally decided, after putting it off, after the cost, after the logistical barrier, after the very reasonable question of whether this will actually be any different from the last time, to look for a therapist. You search, you read profiles, almost everyone says something like LGBTQ plus affirming and gender inclusive or welcome to all identities. Some of them have rainbow flags in their profile photos. Some of them list pronouns in their bio. You pick one, you go. And in the first session, you spend 20 minutes explaining what non-binary means or what dysphoria means or why the political climate right now is not abstract to you. It's your actual life. You spend 20 minutes doing labor that you came there to have someone else help you carry. And you leave tired in a specific way. The way you get tired when you've been performing education instead of receiving care. That gap between what affirming claims to be and what it actually requires is what this episode is about. Welcome back to the Ink Therapist. I'm Del Knight, they, them, licensed psychotherapist, somatic therapist, certified body trust specialist, and someone who is speaking in this episode from inside the community I'm describing, not outside of it. This is episode 4, the final episode of the nervous system arc. Episodes 1 through 3 built the framework, what chronic vigilance is and why it makes sense, what your nervous system is actually doing and why the adaptation story matters, and what slow body-centered therapy looks like in practice. This episode is the one that was always underneath all of it, because everything we've talked about, the chronic vigilance, the nervous system that stays on high alert, the particular exhaustion of bodies that have had real reasons to stay ready, that is not abstract for trans and non-binary people right now. It is immediate. It is daily. It is specific, documented, ongoing weight of living inside a body and an identity that the world keeps trying to legislate against. This episode is for our people specifically. And it's for the clinicians who want to actually serve them. Let's go. The gap, willing versus affirming. I want to start with a distinction that I think matters enormously and gets collapsed constantly. The distinction between a therapist who is willing to work with trans clients and a therapist who is actually affirming. These are not the same thing, not even close. Willing means I won't turn you away. I accept trans clients. I am open to working with you. That's the floor. That's the minimum. That is not a standard worth advertising. Affirming means something different. It means I've done the work, the education, the reading, the supervision, the examination of my own assumptions and biases, and the places where my training defaulted to cisgender experience as the norm. I've done that before you walked in, so that when you arrive, you don't have to do it for me. The distance between willing and affirming is where trans clients spend enormous amounts of energy. It's the energy of explaining, of educating, of translating your experience into terms a therapist can follow, of managing the therapist's learning curve inside sessions that are supposed to be for you. I want to name this clearly, that labor is not a side effect of therapy. It is an obstacle to it. When you spend the first 20 minutes of a session explaining what non-binary means, you have 20 fewer minutes for the actual work you came to do. When you spend energy managing your client's discomfort with the current political reality, you are doing emotional labor for the person who is supposed to be holding space for yours. That's backwards, and it's exhausting. And the fact that it's so common that most trans people have come to expect it as a price of accessing mental health care, that is a failure of the field, not a feature of the population. I also want to name what claiming affirmation without doing the work actually communicates. The rainbow flag in the waiting room, the LGBTQ plus welcoming checkbox on the Psychology Today profile, the pronouns in the bio. None of those things are bad. They signal something, but they are signals, not substance. And when a trans client walks in on the basis of those signals and finds a therapist who doesn't know basic terminology or who treats the gender as the presenting problem, or who asks a question that reveals an assumption rooted in cisnormativity, that gap between signal and substance is its own kind of harm. It is the experience of being told you are welcome and then finding out that welcome wasn't actually prepared for you. Trans people know that experience intimately, from healthcare, from workplaces, from family systems, from religious communities, from public spaces. Therapy should be the place where that experience stops. Not one more place where you arrive and find out the welcome was performative. I want to say one more thing in this section before we get into what affirming actually looks like. Trans-affirming therapy in 2026 cannot be politically neutral. I want to say that directly because I know there are clinicians who operate from a stance of political neutrality, who believe the therapy room should be a space apart from political reality, a place where the outside world is bracketed. That stance is available to people whose identities are not currently under legislative attack. For trans clients in 2026, the political is not separate from the personal. The legislation targeting gender-affirming care, the policies restricting bathroom access, the deliberate rollback of protections that were hard-won over decades, these are not background conditions. They are the daily environment in which a trans person's nervous system is operating. A therapist who asks a trans client to leave the political reality at the door is asking them to leave half of their actual life outside the room. And then wondering why the work doesn't go deep. What affirming therapy actually does. Okay, let me tell you what trans-affirming therapy actually looks like when it's done. Not in general, specifically. 5 things that I think distinguish genuine affirmation from the performative kind. First, informed, not just willing. An affirming therapist has done their own learning, not just about terminology, though terminology does matter, but also about the actual lived landscape of trans experience, what minority stress is and how it accumulates specifically in trans bodies, what the particular grief of medical gatekeeping feels like, what it means to navigate gender transition medically, socially, legally, relationally, and what that process asks the nervous system at every stage. What gender euphoria is and why it's clinically significant. What the research on trans mental health actually says and what it doesn't. A trans client should not have to explain any of this. They should be able to walk in and have the therapist already know the landscape. That's what informed means. Not perfect, not omniscient, but prepared. Second, locating distress correctly. This one is subtle, but it matters enormously. When a trans person is struggling, when they're depressed or anxious or in crisis, an affirming therapist doesn't assume the gender is the problem. They ask, what is actually causing pain here? And the answer is very often transphobia, internalized transphobia, interpersonal transphobia, family rejection, social exclusion, relationship loss, systemic transphobia, the medical system, the legal system, the workplace, the specific accumulated weight of living in a body that the world keeps insisting is either a problem or doesn't exist. That is not the same as the trans person being the problem or their gender being the problem. And a therapist who treats the distress as evidence that the gender is causing harm, who subtly or explicitly suggests that things might be easier if the client reconsidered or slowed down or questioned the identity, is not being careful. They are actually being actively harmful. Locating distress correctly means naming the actual source, which is almost never the identity, which is almost always the response of the world to the identity. Third, gender euphoria, not only dysphoria. I want to spend a little more time on this one because I think it gets dramatically underrepresented in the clinical conversations about trans experience. The framework that most clinicians were trained in, if they were trained in anything about trans experience at all, is organized around dysphoria, the distress of misalignment, the pain of the body not matching the sense of self, the suffering. And dysphoria is real. I'm not dismissing it. It deserves clinical attention and compassionate care. But if dysphoria is the only lens, we miss half the picture. Because gender euphoria is also real. The profound, sometimes overwhelming, sometimes quiet joy of inhabiting a body that finally, in some way, a haircut, a pronoun, a piece of clothing, a medical intervention, reflects who you actually are. The relief of being seen correctly. The specific aliveness of a moment when the inside and the outside align. That is clinically significant. It is not a footnote to the suffering. It is a destination and a guide and a measure of what's actually possible. An affirming therapist asks about the joy, not just the pain. They track both. They make room for both. And they understand that the goal of therapy with a trans client is not just the reduction of dysphoria. It is the expansion of euphoria. The building of a life in which alignment is possible and felt and celebrated. Fourth, no gatekeeping. I need to say something plainly here. A therapist is not an arbiter of a person's gender identity. Full stop. Our role is not to evaluate whether someone is trans enough or certain enough or consistent enough or any other measure that positions us as the authority on an experience that belongs entirely to the person in the room. This has particular clinical significance when it comes to letters. Letters for gender-affirming surgeries, for hormone therapies, for legal name and gender marker changes. The history of letter writing in clinical practice has been, and I'll say this plainly, a history of gatekeeping dressed up as clinical care. Of trans people having to perform a particular narrative, demonstrate a particular certainty, meet a particular standard of transness that a clinician has decided was legitimate. I practice WPATH-informed consent care, which means I start from the premise that you know your own gender. My job is not to verify that. My job is to support you in accessing what you need. Anti-gatekeeping is not about abandoning clinical judgment. It is about applying clinical judgment correctly, which means using it to support care, not to restrict it. And fifth, holding the political reality. I said this at the top of the episode, and I want to return to it here as a clinical practice, not just a political stance. A trans client who comes in during a week when a significant piece of anti-trans legislation has passed, or when a public figure has said something violent about people like them, or when they have had an experience in a public space that reminded them that their safety is contingent, that client is not bringing politics into the therapy room. They are bringing their actual life. An affirming therapist can hold that, can acknowledge that, can name it as the source of a nervous system response rather than treating the response as a symptom unconnecting to its cause. This is where the nervous system arc we've built across 4 episodes comes together. The chronic vigilance in a trans body in 2026 is not a clinical anomaly. It is a reasonable, accurate, adaptive response to a world that is actively producing threat. The work is not to fix the response. The work is to build enough safety, enough genuine, real, embodied safety that the system has somewhere to rest, even briefly, even partially. That's what an affirming therapist is trying to create. Hey, quick pause before we keep going. If you've been listening for a while, you know this show is rooted in the belief that healing shouldn't be a luxury, and I try to practice that, not just say it. At Soma Roots Therapy, I hold sliding scale and pro bono spots for folks who need care and can't afford full fee. Queer, trans, and neurodivergent people especially, who are already navigating systems that weren't built with them in mind. Those spots are real, and keeping them open has a real cost. So I've set up a support page on BuyMeACoffee where you can directly contribute to that access fund. If monthly giving works for you, there are 4 membership tiers starting at $5 a month, from Seed Keeper to Liberation Patron. It all goes towards the same thing. And if monthly isn't your thing, you can also make a one-time contribution at whatever amount feels right. No minimum, no pressure. If that resonates, the link is in the show notes. And if you're in a season where giving isn't possible, that's okay. Just keep listening. That matters too. All right, back to it. The body layer. I want to spend some time on something that I think doesn't get enough attention in conversations about trans-affirming care. The body. I know that may seem obvious. We've spent 4 episodes talking about the body, but I want to be specific about what body-centered work looks like with trans and non-binary clients, because I think the assumption that sometimes gets imported into somatic work from a cisgendered framework can actually cause harm if they're not examined. The relationship between a trans person and their body is complex. I want to say that without making it pathological. For many trans people, the body has been a site of specific pain, dysphoria, medical procedures and their aftermath, the waiting, the accessing, the recovery, the way the body changes and the way it doesn't change as quickly as you need it to, the attention of others, unwanted, sometimes violent, sometimes just invasive. Years, in many cases, of learning to dissociate from a body that felt wrong. And for many trans people, the body is also a site of profound joy. The first time someone used the right pronoun and you felt it in your chest. The morning a medication started working and you looked into the mirror differently. The specific, irreplaceable experience of being in a body that is finally moving towards something rather than away from it. Both of those things are true. Sometimes in the same body, sometimes on the same day at the same time. Somatic therapy doesn't flatten that complexity. It works with it. What this means in practice is that I never assume what a trans client's relationship is to their body. I don't assume that a trans person who hasn't accessed medical transition is in more distress than one who has. I don't assume that surgery or hormones resolve the body relationship, or that a client even wants any sort of surgery or hormones. For some people, they're transformative. For some people, they're one part of a more complex picture. I don't assume that body-centered work is going to be harder for trans clients than for cisgender ones. Sometimes it is. Sometimes trans clients have done profound, intentional work on their relationship to their bodies through community, through gender-affirming care, through sheer necessity. That gives them a depth of somatic awareness that other clients are still building. And I never, ever project either distress or resolution onto somebody's embodied experience. I ask, I follow, I let the client tell me what their body means to them rather than deciding in advance what it must mean. I also want to say something about the particular somatic signatures of trans experience, the specific ways that minority stress, medical gatekeeping, and social navigation show up in the body. The hypervigilance of public spaces, the specific muscular tension of being misgendered and deciding in that moment whether to correct it and what correcting it might cost. The body's response to being dead named, which is not abstract, which registers physiologically, which has a nervous system signature that looks very much like the signatures we talked about in episodes 1 and 2. The fatigue of masking, of performing a gender presentation that doesn't fit in order to be safer, to access a job or a healthcare appointment or a family gathering. The particular grief that lives in trans bodies that have had to delay or forego medical care due to cost, access, geography, or gatekeeping. All of this shows up in the room, in the body, and somatic therapy, done well, done with genuine trans competence, can work with it directly. Not just talking about it, being with it, noticing where it lives, building the kind of safety in the body that allows some of it to settle. And finally, I want to end this section with this because I think it's the most important thing I can say about somatic work with trans clients. There is a particular, profound, specific joy that lives in trans bodies. The joy of alignment, of recognition, of finding a community that sees you, of gender euphoria in its fullest expression, not just the absence of dysphoria, but the presence of something that feels like home. Somatic therapy makes room for that joy to be felt in the body, not just understood in the mind. To let it land, to notice where it lives, to give it the same clinical attention and the same space that we give to pain, because it counts. It is not less real than the suffering. And a practice that only tracks the pain is a practice that only sees half of what's in the room. What you're allowed to expect. I want to speak directly to the trans and non-binary people who are listening to this episode, not the clinicians right now, to you. I want to tell you what you're allowed to expect from a therapist. Not what would be nice, not what would be ideal in the perfect world, what you are actually legitimately allowed to expect from a competent, affirming provider. You are allowed to expect a therapist who already knows what minority stress is, who doesn't need you to explain why living in a trans body in this political moment is exhausting, who has done enough of their own learning that the first session can be about you, not about educating them. You're allowed to expect a therapist who won't flinch at your pronouns, who will use them correctly, consistently, without making a performance of how affirming they are about it, who will correct themselves quickly and without fanfare if they make a mistake, and who won't make you manage their feelings about having made it. You are allowed to expect a therapist who doesn't treat your gender identity as a hypothesis to be tested, who doesn't ask you to justify your identity before they'll support you, who doesn't require a particular narrative or a particular certainty or a particular presentation of transness in order to take you seriously. You are allowed to expect a therapist who can hold the current political reality without catastrophizing it or without dismissing it, who can name transphobia as transphobia when that's what it is, who can understand that your distress in this current climate is not a symptom of an anxiety disorder. It is a rational response to an irrational and hostile situation. You are allowed to expect a therapist who asks about the joy, not just the pain, who makes room for gender euphoria as a clinical goal and not just a footnote, who understands that healing for a trans person is not just the reduction of suffering, but the expansion of something that looks like flourishing. You are allowed to expect, if you need letters or documentation, a therapist who approaches that process from a foundation of informed consent and anti-gatekeeping, who doesn't require you to perform a narrative that isn't yours, who doesn't add barriers to care that the standards of practice don't actually require. I want to say something that I mean very sincerely. Every single thing I just listed, that is not a high bar. I know it can feel like a high bar. I know that the experience of trying to find affirming care in a system that is often not built to provide it can make these things feel like luxury items. Nice if you can find them, but not something you're entitled to expect. That is not true. Those things are the floor. You deserve a therapist who already knows the landscape and is ready to do the actual work with you when you walk in. You shouldn't have to earn your way into being seen. Not here, not anywhere. A note to clinicians. I want to spend a few moments speaking to the clinicians who are listening. And I know there are some because this kind of content tends to travel into clinical spaces, and because I think a lot of therapists are genuinely trying to figure out how to do this work better. So I want to be honest with you about what I think this work actually requires. It's going to require ongoing education, not a single training, not a one-time workshop that gets added to your CE portfolio and then gets filed away. Ongoing engagement with the current literature, current standards of care, current community experience. The landscape of trans healthcare, trans legal rights, and trans community experience is not static. It is changing, sometimes rapidly, sometimes in response to legislative attack, sometimes in response to community-led evolution in how identity and care are understood. A therapist who did their trans competency training 5 years ago and hasn't engaged with the topic since then is not current. The field has moved. That's not a criticism. That's just the reality of doing competent care in a rapidly evolving area, and it requires a commitment to staying current that doesn't end. It requires examining your assumptions. Most of us, regardless of our own identities, were trained in frameworks that centered cisgender experience as the default, that treated deviation from binary gender as either a clinical presentation requiring explanation or a social phenomenon that wasn't our business. They may have used language or operated from conceptual frameworks that we now understand to be harmful. That is not a moral indictment of your training. That's the reality of working in a field that is still catching up to the communities it's supposed to serve. But catching up requires noticing where the old frameworks are still operating, where you make assumptions about a client's body or identity or desire that you haven't examined, where your clinical curiosity is actually a form of interrogation, where your neutral stance is actually a choice to not name something that needs to be named. That's internal work. It doesn't stop. It requires getting supervision, real, informed supervision from someone who knows this area. Not just peer consultation with colleagues who are also figuring it out. Supervision from a clinician with genuine expertise in trans-affirming care who can help you see what you're missing, who will push back when your framing is off, who can hold you accountable to the standard rather than just the intention. I say this as someone who supervises other clinicians. The willingness to be supervised, to stay in a learning posture, to have your work examined by someone who knows more than you do in this area is one of the clearest markers of a clinician who is serious about doing this right. And it requires something that doesn't fit neatly into a continuing education category. It requires actually giving a damn. I know that sounds simplistic, but I've sat with enough trans clients who have been failed by technically competent clinicians, people who knew the terminology, who had the training hours, who would have passed any competency assessment, but who were not actually invested in their clients flourishing as a trans person, who saw the gender as a complication rather than a context, who were subtly rooting for a particular outcome, who brought their own unexamined feelings about trans identities into the room without knowing it. The technical knowledge matters, and the genuine investment in trans flourishing, not just trans survival, not just trans stability, but actual trans joy, That matters too. If you're doing this work, I want you to be honest with yourself about whether you have both. All right, we've been in 4 episodes together. Episode 1, chronic vigilance is a trauma response. Your body isn't wrong for staying alert, it's just doing its job. Episode 2, your nervous system isn't broken, it's adapted. The language of dysfunction isn't accurate, the language of adaptation is. Episode 3, healing moves slowly, not because you're behind, because that's how it actually works. And now episode 4, affirming therapy is not a sticker in a window, it's a practice. It's a commitment. It's a room that is actually prepared for you when you walk in. Those 4 things together are a way of seeing, a way of understanding what your nervous system is doing, why it makes sense, and what healing can look like, and what you deserve to be able to expect from the people who are supposed to help you. I hope something in this arc has landed for you. I want to leave you with one thing. Not a technique, not a reframe, just a sentence. Your nervous system has been doing its best with what it had. Whatever it looks like, the hypervigilance, the shutdown, the reactivity, the numbness, the chronic exhaustion of never quite being okay. It has been doing its best with the information it had and the circumstances it was in towards the goal of keeping you alive and functional. It deserves something better than a war. And you deserve the kind of space and the kind of therapist and the kind of care that can offer it something different. That's the whole show, really. If this arc brought you somewhere, if something across these 4 episodes named something you've been carrying without language, Soma Roots Therapy is actively accepting new clients in Oregon and Washington. Shout out to my Bellingham folks. Sessions are done via telehealth. I'm in network with a variety of commercial insurances. Sliding scale and self-pay options are also available. Everything I've talked about in this arc, the somatic approach, the slow pace, the decolonial frame, and the body-centered work, the genuine trans-affirming care, that's what I do. That's what this practice is actually built for. The link to reach out is in the show notes. Come when you're ready. There's no rush. That's kind of the whole thing. The next episode of The Ink Therapist will be stepping outside the nervous system arc and into something I've wanted to talk about for a long time. We're going to talk about the phrase, "it could be worse," what it's doing to your nervous system when you say it to yourself, why it's sometimes a survival strategy that outlasted its context, and why your pain is allowed to be what it actually is without a comparative scale. That one's going to be a little funny and also genuinely important. I hope you'll be there. Thank you for being in this arc with me for 4 episodes, for the time it takes to listen slowly to something that asks you to feel things. It matters. You matter. I'm Del Knight. This is the Ink Therapist. Slow down, feel it, root deeper. See you next time.